Welcome to We Flew, We Fly, a podcast presented by the Dedalians. Join us as we delve into flightline stories and insights from military aviators, past and present, who have answered the nation's call during peacetime and war. Strap in and get ready for takeoff.
All right, I'll give you the clap for the sync. Welcome to the We Flew, We Fly podcast. I'm your host, Dan Clark. And today our guest is Colonel Eileen Collins, United States Air Force retired. And in her 27 years of service to the country, she has amassed quite a few aviation firsts. She's flown over 30 aircraft, but she was the first flight instructor in the T-38, first to be an astronaut mission pilot in the space shuttle program, and the first to command a space shuttle program. In her distinguished career, and we also have our book here, which we're going to talk a lot about today, but just a lot of firsts and a lot of accomplishments and a lot of grit and a lot of determination. The book was fantastic and fun to read. So I'm really excited that you joined us here today, Eileen.
Well, thanks. Thank you for having me. And also thank you for reading my book. I think everything in there is true. Everything in there really happened. And I think that people will enjoy reading about my flying stories.
Yeah.
And let me say one thing. There's a lot written about me that says I was the first woman T-38 instructor pilot. That was actually Connie Engel. I was the first woman instructor pilot at my base.
Advanced
Air Force Base. But about 2 years before me, Connie Engel she was in the first class of women. There were 10 of them that went through pilot training in 1976 at Williams Air Force Base. And Connie, not only was she the class leader, but she graduated number one in her class. And they brought her back as a T-38 instructor. And so Connie was actually the first. I was the second in the Air Force overall.
I had another question, first question, and I'll pull it right out of the middle of the format. You flew in Grenada in the C-141.
Yes, I did. That was 1983, October of 1983. People probably remember when there was an invasion by the Cuban soldiers of Grenada, and Ronald Reagan was president at the time, and he was going to have none of that. So he sent our military down there to basically free the island, to give it back to the people that live there. I happened to be out in the system at the time in the 141. We were actually alerted. There was another incident that happened just a few days before Grenada. There were hundreds of Marines that were killed by a bombing over in Beirut, Lebanon. So our crew was alerted to pick up some Marines and pick them up at Cherry Point, take them over to Beirut. On our way back, we stopped at Dover. The command post called us in and said, "We're sending you to Grenada." And we said, "Grenada, where's that?" Haven't you heard? We are invading Grenada. So I went down there. It was the second day. The initial U.S. invasion had already happened. We had secured the field, and I went down there on the second day. It was a war zone without a doubt. I mean, my eyes were like bugging out when we land there. And the other interesting thing about Grenada, not only did we took about 100 of the 82nd Airborne soldiers down there. The command post called us and said, "Can you wait? We've got some students, medical students, who had been held captive by the Cuban soldiers that were freed." So I don't know what happened. Apparently they were hostages, actually. And after the U.S. did the initial invasion, these soldiers fled, and the students that were held hostage were let go. So they got on the plane with us, and we brought 36 of them back to Charleston Air Force Base. And we were met at Charleston. It was night. All the lights were out on the ramp. The base commander, wing commander, the mayor, all these people, the press was all out there. And these medical students got off the plane. They were kissing the ground, and they were saying, "Thank you, Ronald Reagan, for doing what you did." And they were very, very scared, and some of them had their children with them. And we were sitting up in the cockpit of the C-141 just watching all this play out there on the ramp, and like nobody cared about the pilots.
Yeah.
But it was probably one of the most rewarding flights I've ever done, knowing that we had actually rescued 36 people that felt like, I've never been a hostage, but I can't imagine what that feels like.
Mm.
And it was very rewarding to bring them back. I still have mementos that the children were writing, like pictures of they were drawing pictures of the airplane and saying, thank you, pilots. And of course, we had our flight engineers and our loadmasters part of the crew
Mhm.
that, they all, we were all just so excited. We broke many rules in the book going down there. One of them was oxygen masks. So we get these 82nd Airborne soldiers on the plane. We're at Pope Air Force Base, and these guys are jumping up and down on the plane's shaking. The loadmaster called to us before we took off to head to Grenada. The loadmaster called us and said, we can't go, we don't have enough oxygen masks. So they went looking for oxygen masks, couldn't find them. And the command post said, go anyway. We were like throwing the rule book out. Like, it's nice to know the rules, but when it comes time to actually go into a combat zone, you got to get the mission done. And you have to, but I also believe you have to know which rules you're breaking. You don't want to just, haphazard. So what was the risk there? I mean, if we had lost pressure at high altitude, I don't know if they would have had to share oxygen masks until we could drop down to a lower altitude. And we went down there with we didn't have any escort. It was just our C-141 by itself. And, I asked, what do we do if we get, intercepted by, a MiG or something? And they're like, we don't know. Just go. You need to hurry to get down there. It's like, we're like, okay. So we took a little bit of risk ourselves heading down there, and there was no fuel at the airport. So I mean, there was I could keep going on, but for me, it was a very, very exciting mission. And most of the time that I flew in the Air Force, we were at peace, as opposed to what happened after, once we got into the decade of the 2000s, we've got more and more people with combat experience now. And back then in the 80s and even the 90s, there were very few people that had any combat experience. And we're like, what do we do? So, you just kind of, it's your training that comes, everything that you learned. And by the way, everything that I have read in the history of aviation, I read World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. I read I loved reading military history. And I think all the military history I read, it really helped me be a better pilot throughout my career.
Yeah, I was curious as to whether or not that turned into a first. As your Air Force career progresses, and you have a little some badge there that most others don't have, a little combat recognition.
Yeah. So I really don't know the answer to that, but I can say that there were many women that went down to Grenada. I don't know who went in first. I can say that the initial wave, I am pretty sure there were no women on the initial wave because they were all doing airdrop. In 1983, women were still not allowed to fly in combat. That law changed in 1993. But in 1983, by law, women were not allowed in combat. So women were not checked out, for example, in C-141 airdrop. So the crews, and actually some of my friends, some of my actually pilot training classmates went in there in the first wave. And they were out of Charleston, which flew the airdrop mission back in those days. And it wasn't until, so the mission that we went in, we weren't doing any airdrop. I was at, my base was Travis, which that was not part of the mission. So they were kind of sending the women to the bases that did not do airdrop. Like if you sent a woman to Charleston, for example, that was frustrating for the schedulers and, for the leadership there. They're like, hey, we're having trouble scheduling. We have to make sure that the women don't fly these missions. They can fly these, but they can't fly these. So don't send any more women to Charleston or one of the other airdrop bases. So I got sent to Travis, which basically, we did air refueling. We did a lot of, I want to say, strategic airlift. The reason I ended up going into Grenada on the second day was they needed crews immediately, and they didn't have time to go like nitpicking so we just happened to be out in the system. We were at Dover. The mission I flew did not need to be airdrop. I mean, we actually landed, and nobody checked to see if there were women on the crews. But we went in and did the briefing. They saw that I was there. Nobody said anything. They're like, you need to go right now. We don't have time to mess with this thing. And so I know that there were women pilots, flight engineers, and loadmasters that went down to Grenada. And, we got like a little bit of hazardous duty pay. And we, depending on what you did, some people got various medals for going in there. And then after the fact, the leadership was saying, we sent women into a combat zone. And what are we going to do about that? And so it just kind of, people like talked about it for like the next 10 years or so until finally in 1993, they changed the law. And there's not a lot of women that are like, hey, send me into combat. I want to go do that. You don't have a lot of women that want to do that, but you have some very talented women that do want to do that and that are great fighter pilots today, really some tough gals, I'll tell you. So now it makes it a little bit easier for the scheduling and, the personnel side of it. But I think also you're getting the best people in the job.
Yeah. Now, maybe even 5 or even 7 years before that, you're like just in maybe community college and whatnot. One of the things I like from the early background of the book is you arrived at high school graduation and there was this weight that said, all right, Eileen, what am I going to do now? What are you going to do now, Eileen? And maybe it was the voice of parents, coaches, or your own voice, but tell us a little bit about how you got to that point on high school graduation.
Yeah, so this is a good story for young people. When I was in high school, I'm not sure I actually tried. Well, I know I didn't try as hard as I could. I was, kind of a hangout with my friends. And if you were smart and you got A's, like the boys would make fun of you and they would kind of, not like you if you were too smart. So I didn't really try that hard in high school. And I regret that. So on graduation day, we had the awards. And I'm watching classmates go up on the stage. They're getting scholarships to great colleges. They're winning awards. And I'm sitting there watching this whole thing going, I kind of wasted my high school years. I never really tried. I went to community college, partly because, I couldn't get into the really elite schools that I wanted to go to, but also my mother was very sick and I needed to stay home and take care of her. So I spent 2 years at a community college and now I didn't have the social pressures I had in high school. And I buckled down and I decided, what do I like? This is what my dad used to say to me. Stop following the crowd. What does Eileen want to do? Don't worry about what your friends are doing. You need to look at yourself. What do you want to do with your life? So my dad had the really good message. And I started thinking, I like math. I've always been good at math. I never tried because I didn't want to be picked on. I didn't want to be bullied. And I said, no one's going to bully me in college now. I mean, no one's going to care. So I took math and science and I loved it. And I worked very, very hard. And I ended up my grades were getting better and better, which allowed me to get into Syracuse University and allowed me to get the ROTC scholarship that I had been wanting. But I had to show them that I had the discipline and the smarts to do that. And so they had my grades from my freshman year and my first semester of my sophomore year. I sent those off to the Air Force ROTC program and Syracuse University, and I got in. And so that was when things really started taking off in my life. And I think my message to young people is there is so much social pressure. I think the social pressure is worse today because you got the phones and all the social media going on. I think it's better for women because I don't see smart young women getting bullied the way my generation did. I think it's more acceptable to be smart in high school, and that's good, but keep working at it. And that's my message to it's for the young men too. Really apply yourself in high school and try not to let all these social pressures dictate the decisions that you make. You want to look at yourself and do what you want to do. Be a leader. And so that's what my dad would say to me. Be a leader. What does Eileen want to do? Don't follow the crowd. And I think that is really an excellent message that, my dad's passed away now, but I really, his voice is still echoing in my mind.
Yeah, you credit him with having a very structured, he knew right from wrong and he wasn't afraid to just, let people know when they crossed the line. So sounds like a very stern gentlemen, you know?
Yeah, that's right. But both my parents were my role models.
Yeah.
They both made a lot of mistakes. No parent is perfect. No,
Yeah.
I raised two kids myself. They're both in their 20s now. And I always tell them, y'all need to learn from my mistakes. And I made a lot of mistakes on my kids. Usually the first one gets the most mistakes.
Yeah.
But they're like, Mom, just don't worry about it. But I watched my parents who both struggled. And my dad was a drinker. My mother, she was always smoking. And, I won't go into all their issues, but I would watch them. They were both very wise and they were both very decisive. And I think that rubbed off on me. And I don't know if I'll ever be quite the people that they were. But I try to learn from their mistakes, and I try to aspire to live the kind of life that I mean, they didn't have a lot of money, but they kept trying. They kept working. They had it tough. I mentioned in my book that we were on welfare for a time. We went into the Medicaid program, which is Medicaid is for people that really don't have the money for health care.
Mm-hmm.
And we had the food stamps at the grocery store. We had to separate the paper products from the food products. And I don't feel bad that we had to do that. It was a little bit embarrassing, but I think that I learned more from having a rough upbringing than if everything had been perfect. So my message now for parents is, it's okay if your kids don't have everything, and it's okay if you make some mistakes raising them. They're going to be fine as long as you keep the communication going.
Yeah. Let them know that they're loved and they're safe and they're secure, all that.
Exactly.
I had a similar experience myself growing up. And your senior year in high school, you were kind of like the de facto parent for a little while there, raising your younger siblings. Your mom was, you guys had that flood from the hurricane. And so that will definitely, you strapped on the leadership hat, or the leadership boots, you might say, at a younger age.
Yeah, and I always say we never know what we're capable of until we're tested.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom and dad split up when I was 9 years old, which was unheard of back in those days. I mean, we were the only kid I knew that had parents that weren't together. I was the only person I knew. But so my dad moved out of town, and so my mom was a single mom raising four of us. We had the flood went through, and that was really hard on my mother. And I won't get into the flood itself is bad enough. It's the aftermath that's the worst.
Mm-hmm.
The smell and the dirt, and it just takes forever to clean up after everybody's garbage goes, down your street and into your house. And then there was a time my mother had to go in the hospital, so she was gone for a little over a month. Mm. I was 17 years old, and I was a senior in high school, and my sister was a sophomore, and then I had my little brother. He was in like 7th grade or something. And my grandmother she came and stayed with us one night, but she couldn't do it. She was just too old. So I said, Grandma, just go back home. We're going to be okay. And so nobody knew. So I had just gotten my driver's license, and I did the grocery shopping. My dad gave me some money. So I did the grocery shopping. I drove, my brother and sister to school, and, it was okay. Mm. And so we got into a routine, and I kind of liked it. Yeah. And I think that, that was really my first leadership challenge in my life, because I didn't play a lot of sports. Girls weren't in sports back in those days. I think sports are great for leadership training, and I encourage young people to, whatever sport you like, do that, because you learn leadership and followership. For me, I didn't have that opportunity really. Well, let me correct that. The opportunity was probably there, but it was something that girls just didn't do back in those days. So taking care of my family was my first leadership opportunity. And then I went out and started getting part-time jobs, which, by the way, I'm a big proponent of part-time jobs. They might be, like not what you want to do. I call them crappy jobs. Right. But I think doing these crappy jobs and making minimum wage is really good for developing wisdom and gaining confidence in yourself. Yeah.
Sense of humility as well.
Yeah. And definitely a sense of humility, because you have to go out there and make mistakes. And I say, do it while you're young, and make small mistakes. Like, don't make big mistakes, but make the small mistakes and learn from them. And I still think about all the lessons I learned. I was a janitor in high school. I cleaned a room, and I made a little bit of money. I had room 202, so I made a little money doing that. And I did things like miniature golf. I painted things. I worked at my church. I counted the collection money on Sunday morning, which I loved. I had, like, money everywhere. It's like, that was really fun. And I was a hostess. I worked at a catalog showroom store. I worked at a pizza place, and they were all good jobs.
Mm.
I really enjoyed it, and it was nice to have a paycheck come in.
Yeah. One of the things that I really made me smile was when maybe it was an Air Force recruiter, you had an appointment and he no-showed you, and your dad had kind of you will not enlist, whatever it was. But then the day came when you let him know about the ROTC opportunity. He had a different take on that.
Yeah, so that is a crazy story. I was a senior in high school, and I said to my dad, I'm going to join the Air Force. And he said, you are not joining anything, no military, you are not. So my dad was in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So he was in the Navy in the war in the Pacific. So I don't know what he was thinking, but my dad scared me. And I'm like, okay. So months went by, and now I didn't know that you had to be an officer to be a pilot. You just didn't really have all that information back in those days. So I thought, I want to be an Air Force pilot, so I'm going to go enlist. So I called the recruiter, defying my dad. But it was several months. I figured things had cooled down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he forgot. And I set up an appointment. It was for 4:00 in the afternoon. I still drive by that place when I go back to my hometown. The recruiter's not in that building anymore, but I showed up at 4:00 and the door was locked and no one was in there. And I was almost in tears. I got back in the car and I said, well, maybe the Air Force isn't for me. And so I went the community college route. And somewhere along the line, I saw, oh, you need to have a 4-year college degree to be an Air Force pilot. I didn't know that. And so that's when I went the ROTC route. So I almost enlisted. I don't know what would have happened. I mean, I probably would have eventually gone through pilot training, but I don't think that it would have been much, much later, and my career would have been totally different.
Yeah, the game clock would have expired on your opportunity to join.
Now, who has ever heard of a recruiter not showing up at an appointment? That's their job.
Yeah.
So why wasn't he there? Maybe there was intervention from, I don't know. All I can guess is he had a family emergency. That's the only thing I could guess.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't even leave a note on the door. And nobody texted. No one had mobile phones back in those days. But no, never heard a thing from him.
Yeah. I was a kid growing up. My grandfather had a book of World War II airplanes, and we lived close to a naval air station close to Newport, Rhode Island. So there was a lot of naval aviation going on. So as a little tyke, there were C-130s in the traffic pattern around my house all the time. So I get into high school, a recruiter calls me. He goes, hey, what do you want to do? I go, I want to be a pilot. I want to be a military pilot. He's like, the best military pilots are mechanics first. And I go, sign me up. And so off I went, I didn't ask, I should have gotten a second opinion, So that locked door, that missed appointment kind of opened another door for you there. So.
Yeah. There's all these kind of like forks in the road that you hit in your life. And I often, it makes me nervous to think back and say, well, what if that fork went the other way? Because there's many other stories like that, and everyone has them in their life. What if I had done this, and what if that accident didn't happen, or what if I made this decision instead? What would life be like? And you just can't be. They're kind of, if you want to do that for the fun of it, great, but you can't be questioning the past too much.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to live in the present. I probably live in the future a little too much, but I really don't like living in the past, and which is why it took me so long to write my book. The only reason I wrote that book is the pandemic, because I travel a lot, and I do a lot of different things now. And when the pandemic hit, my life stopped. I started doing more Zoom meetings, but I hated being home. I hated it. And my co-author, who had been calling me for, I want to say over a year, I'll help you write a book. I called him and said, I'm ready to do the book. I have nothing else to do. So that's why it's hard for me to relive the past. But once I started writing the book, and the way I wrote, I would write a chapter and I would send it to my co-author, and he would, kind of do a little research on some of the things that, the technical things in the book. And, he also wrote the proposal for the book to get a publisher. But it was hard for me I don't like looking at the past, but once I started writing the book, I got going, and it was a little bit easier. And I went down a lot of rabbit holes. Like, I'd start researching something and I'd get pulled off because I love military history, and I'd like try to look something up, and then something would catch my attention, and I'd spend, 30 minutes like reading a story about something that happened, that for example, I was trying to research the history of women in the military, and there are a lot of really interesting stories out there. But anyway.
So this your high school experience is in the early 70s, mid 70s, right? Thereabouts. So when you mentioned Dad was vehement about not joining the military, the Vietnam War was at the dinner table on TV every night, and maybe he had a protective instinct about him, but. Then you get into the ROTC program in Syracuse, and you had a good mentor there who kind of put you in for the pilot training, right? Because he was paying attention to that.
Yeah. Two things I want to say there. On my dad, he was okay with me joining ROTC because he found out that I had applied and received a scholarship. So he seemed to be okay with that. And, I chose Syracuse because, I went to visit there, and they were very welcoming. And they were describing the program and what they had. And I was really impressed with the program, ROTC program at Syracuse. So once I started, I had, being a math major, they assigned me to a job called Computer Systems Design Engineer. And I had an assignment to Offutt Air Force Base, which at the time was the Strategic Air Command headquarters. And I was to do missile targeting. And I was like, I'm a second lieutenant, and they're going to put me in missile targeting. And this was around Christmas time of my senior year at Syracuse. Well, then along comes this opportunity for women to go to pilot training. And my professor of aerospace studies, which you're asking me about here, his name was Colonel Vernon Hagen. He had flown F-4s and B-52s in Vietnam. And I had a lot of respect for this guy. We didn't see him very often. I don't know what else he had going on, but he called me in his office and told me about, hey, there's this test program going on right now. Women in military pilot training. They're trying to see if women can fly military aircraft. Well, at the time, the first class was going through at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona, and I was aware of that. But now they were expanding the program to take women right out of college, because the previous women came off active duty. They had already been in a job somewhere. They were known entities. So I applied to the first class of women to go right out of college. And it turned out that there were 8 of us that were selected, and 4 went to Williams and 4 went to Vance Air Force Base. And I was in the class of the 4 that went to Vance. But what had happened along the way is I failed the eye exam. They sent me in to take the pilot eye exam. I had to take the several other written tests. But I failed the eye exam because my left eye failed the distant vision. I say failed, I was 20/25. So I was 20/20 everywhere, and I passed the colorblind and the depth perception. But my distant vision in this eye was 20/25. And at the time, ROTC, you had to be perfect. So I failed the eye exam for pilot training. And when I came back, and I was devastated, just completely devastated. So a couple of days go by, and Colonel Hagen called me in the office, and I reported in, and I'm all like, what's going on here? And he said, Miss Collins, I'm going to send you back in 2 weeks to take that eye test again. I want you to stop studying so hard, take care of your eyes, and we'll give it another shot. And I said, thank you, sir. And I started eating carrots, which is where my parents told me carrots are good for your eyes. I ate so many carrots, my fingertips turned orange. And for 2 weeks, if you ever do it, your fingers will turn orange. I don't think that's very healthy, so I'm not recommending that. But I went back and I did a lot of resting. I did eye exercises, and I went back and I passed the test. So I just barely, just barely got into pilot training with the eye exam. And by the way, and I thank Colonel Hagen for that. He gave me a second chance. And today I wonder, I've been a colonel myself. I kind of wonder if Colonel Hagen called out to that medical facility and said, don't be so hard on this person. I mean, maybe he said let her squint or something like that, but I passed it the second time. And so I got into pilot training.
So from your childhood and time spent in the library, right, where your mom would take you there, you got the first idea back then to be an astronaut and a pilot. They kind of went together, right? So
that's right.
So now you're kind of learning to map out the path. I guess it was easy to figure out that this is the way the male astronauts go, and nobody had a path for women astronauts, right? So, but that gets you to flight school. So you're still holding on to that astronaut idea, or
yeah? So I got the astronaut idea in fourth grade. Of course, I was reading a lot of books about pilots, and all throughout my life, but there were no books on astronauts because it was such a new thing. And I read about the Gemini astronauts when I was about 9 or 10 years old. And I remember there were no women, but for some reason at that age, that didn't bother me. I said, I'm going to be a lady astronaut. I want to do exactly what these guys are doing. And I read about them, and they were military. They were all military pilots, and they were mostly test pilots. They were engineers. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I want to do. So I had that kind of in the back of my mind, and I never told anyone, because back in those days, I figured they're all going to laugh at me, in which they would have thought I was crazy. Women can't be astronauts, I'm sure. But when I was very young, the fact that there were no women astronauts didn't really bother me. I just thought, well, I'll just be a lady astronaut. But then as I got in high school and college, I went, ooh, this is not good. Why are there no women? And that for the astronaut part, that changed in 1978 when NASA hired their first class of space shuttle astronauts. That was 1978. They hired 35, they called themselves 35 new guys. 6 of them were women, and they were all mission specialists. They were engineers, doctors, mostly in scientists, engineers, doctors, scientists. And they didn't hire women as pilots back in those days because there just weren't enough women pilots at the time. And of the very few that they did have, they haven't worked their way through the pipeline far enough where they could get the experience to be eligible for the shuttle pilot program. And it wasn't until really my generation got there that women were really eligible for the flying portion of the astronaut program.
Because you've had many, you were turned down several times in your application.
Oh.
But at some point you had to, like, you were putting, as I was reading through, I was seeing how the checklist to become an astronaut was growing. You needed to have the STEM degree. You needed to have, or it was very admirable to have that, right? They wanted you to be a test pilot graduate. And then you needed to have 1,000 hours mission time.
That's right.
And so this checklist just began to emerge. But again, we're at flight school, and you show up at Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma. And one of the things that jumped out at me was one of the wives just said, "We don't want you here."
Oh, that's a good story. Yeah. So I was in the first class of women to go through pilot training at Vance, and there were only 4 of us. And people know pilot training bases have like 500 pilots. And so here come these women. We're walking around in these green flight suits, and we kind of turn heads of people. And my thought was, I just want to be the best pilot I can be. And I'm not going to disturb the culture. But I kind of wondered if it's just human nature. There's probably some men that don't want the women there. But I found that the men were really supportive. If there were any that didn't want us there, we just weren't aware of that. So my first week, I decide to go to the commissary and buy some food. So I'm in the line at the commissary, and the civilian woman behind the cash register, saw me and said, "Are you one of those new women pilots that we've been hearing about?" Of course, I'm in my flight suit. And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And she just blurted out, "The wives don't want you here," which shocked me. I was totally shocked. I thought maybe she'd say, "The men don't want you here." So the wives don't want you here. So I said, "Why?" And she said, "They don't want you going cross country with their husbands." I said, "Oh, that makes sense. I totally understand that." But I'm glad that she was so honest with me, because I made it a point to get to know the wives. And we're not here to break up families. We're not here to look for a husband. We are here to be pilots. We want to fly in the Air Force. And we had our first class party that weekend. And I went to I love this story. I showed up late at the class party, and most of my classmates were Air Force Academy graduates that had gotten married. And I walked into the party, and all the guys were in the dining room on the left side, and they're over there talking about the checklist and the instructors and procedures and what you need to know and all the gossip that they had heard about pilot training. And all the wives were in the right in the living room, and they were talking. I specifically remember they were talking about how to get curtains in base housing. And I looked and I went, "Where do I go?" I felt like I didn't belong there. So I remembered the gal at the commissary, and I went over and I spent like the whole time with the wives. And I was like, I'm not a threat, and I wanted them to get to know me and get to know the other women. And we're still women. I'm not coming to pilot training as a man. I'm going to pilot training as a woman. We had to figure out how to do this whole thing. And that was great. So I actually still keep in touch with one of the wives today from my, actually a couple from, I mean, how long ago is it? 40 some years ago, I went through pilot training. So it's good. And I love the Air Force culture, and I love the way the families support each other. And there was one other time that I was flying C-141s, the wing commander called me in, and he actually asked me, he goes, "I'm really trying to figure this out. I don't know what to do with the women, and how we get promoted and how we become commanders." And he told me that my wife works as hard as I do, and she has a role as a wing commander's wife. And I completely understood where he was coming from. And I really didn't have an answer for him. I said, we'll just have to kind of see how it works out, see how we get through it all. And, it seems to me that things are working out okay. I don't think we're going to have, the entire Air Force run by women. It's just not going to be that way. I think that we are at a very stable point right now. And not every woman wants to be a pilot, but now women can be a pilot if they choose what they want to do. They can do that. So I think we're at a good, stable place today. We're not without problems, because I'm still hearing people come to me that, but that's, to me, a culture will never be perfect. Cultures will always have issues, because we're all humans and nobody's perfect. So we're always going to have issues, but as long as we're willing to talk about them and we feel comfortable having a place to go to say, well, something over here is not working, or I have, someone in my unit that's, maybe, causing issues and we need to talk about it. As long as we have a system to allow people to talk about problems, that's good. And I think we had that back when I went through pilot training in the 70s. I think we still had a system. I had tremendously good support from all of my commanders. They were just absolutely great. And, I don't really have any negative stories to tell. So I like to tell young people, sometimes you'll hear in the news that someone's having a big issue in the military somewhere. That doesn't mean that's going to happen to you. We hear a lot of stories about, people, without getting into anything specific, you don't hear about the good stories. I have a bunch of, which is part of the reason I wrote the book. I have a bunch of great stories, and I loved all my time in the Air Force and all the people that I worked with. And, it was just such a great experience. I encourage young people to sign up, whatever service you want to go into, whether you want to be enlisted or officer or whatever career field you want. You come out of the military with confidence. You're a decision maker. You're not perfect, but I think that the confidence that you have having been in the military is something that's very hard to replace that on this in the civilian world, or to get that kind of, I want to say, leadership opportunities at such a young age in the civilian world. You get that in the military.
Yeah. Now, you're also part of this first wave, right, of women step in and creating these scenarios where wing commanders need some tips and techniques, right? What impressed me throughout the book is how you were able to just say, well, I'm married to my airplane, and my job here is just to be the best pilot I can. And so you had a mental discipline to let a lot of this noise flow past you, and that was very prevalent. Every time the stakes were higher, you seemed to know it's time to focus and what to focus on.
Yeah, so I was a terrible teenager. And I think back to, I think I could have been a lot more disciplined as a teenager. And I think that when I went through pilot training, the little techniques I learned there helped me to be a better person. For example, things like if you have an emergency in the airplane, instead of just like, what am I going to do? And you kind of, I don't want to say panic, but you could panic. We were taught the first thing you do is maintain aircraft control. Then you analyze the situation and take proper action. And then you land as soon as conditions permit. And then we had boldface. So you had to memorize, like if you have an engine fire, or if you lose your engines, or if you lose cabin pressurization, you memorize these boldface procedures. And so if this ever happens, you're not going to panic. You have something to fall back on. And there's other techniques like aviate, navigate, communicate, like you do things in that order. I started applying those things to my life in the way I make decisions every day. And so based on my training, beginning in pilot training and all throughout the airplanes that I've flown in test pilot school and being an astronaut, I've come down with three things. One of them is dealing with decisions. One is dealing with conflict, and one is dealing with mistakes. Those are three things that can give you anxiety. And now we hear people like, oh, I have anxiety. And I'm like, well, you shouldn't have anxiety. There are ways to handle that. So I have disciplined myself when I am faced with any of those three things, making a tough decision, having conflict going on around me, and the third is mistakes. I have steps to go through for all of those. I even wrote a speech about this, which can get kind of long, so I'm not going to go into it now. But everyone can do that for themselves, and then you can break it down into like a flow chart. Well, like take decisions, for example. Do I need to make it immediately right now, or can I wait? If I wait, do I need to make this myself, or can I do it with a group of people? And who do I need to help me out with this? What kind of research? So I go through these flow charts. For the one on mistakes, I have a 4-step process because I would make a lot of mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. And I would ruminate over my mistakes. Like, how could you be so stupid, Eileen? How could you do that? Like back when I was in pilot training, or whether I was an instructor and let my student get away, maybe I let my student go too far. So my 4 steps are: you admit your mistake. Don't ever try to cover it up because someone's life could be at stake. So you admit your mistake. Secondly, you fix your mistake. The third is you do something to prevent it from happening again. And the fourth is you move on. And you don't want to be dwelling on your mistake because you're going to make another mistake, and you just clouds your thinking. So I've got all those little things. And I think I only am like this because of my time in the military. In flying, yes, because I think flying, you're even more disciplined because your life is at stake. And many other jobs in the military, you're going into hazardous situations and you have to be disciplined. And which is why I say procedural. I've gotten very procedural because I know that when I get emotional, or when I used to, when I was a teenager, get emotional, I was not thinking logically. And the procedural thinking, or like the boldface, or the practice that you run through in your head, really I think has probably saved my life at some point along the way. But I think it's also I lead a very low anxiety life right now because I've just trained myself to not let that happen. And I think stress is one of the worst things for the human body, mentally, physically, and emotionally. Stress will age you, and stress will kill you. And so I think that we all need to have techniques to manage our stress if we want to live a long and healthy life.
A couple of quotes I lifted from what I think are, if I did this correctly, from your Air Force years prior to NASA that I thought were noteworthy was concentrate on how you show up in life. Like, I like that one. That's really good, because that's set your intention, execute, Second was take control of the situation. I think that's probably came out of the flight and structure section. And then control and performance. Control and performance, my note said it was linked to the instrument flight analogy. And those were the big ones I kind of lifted.
Yeah, I could talk about any one. Let me pick the control and performance one because that kind of goes along with what the last topic we were talking about. There are things in life you can control, and there are things you can't control. And if you try to control things that you really can't, that's going to result in stress, anxiety, unhappiness, and frustration, not just for you, but for people around you. So I think we really need to know what we can control. So in the airplane, the control instruments are the attitude indicator or the horizon. Just you can control where you put the airplane. Attitude. You can also control the power because we have our throttles to set. And then what I would teach my students is whatever maneuver you're flying, you set those two things. You set the picture and you set the power. What comes out of that is the performance, which is your airspeed, your altitude, your climb rate, your descent rate, vertical velocity. And that's the control and performance concept, which we really taught in instrument flying. So I would memorize the attitude. Let's say you're in the weather and you're coming in to fly to minimums or something. I would memorize the pitch and on the attitude, and I'd memorize the power settings, whether the gear's up or down or whatever. And I would tell my students, you need to memorize these things. I mean, you can try to wing it, but you're not going to fly the best. The performance would be, let's say you're coming down on an instrument approach and you want 700 feet per minute, pick a number. There's a delay in that instrument. So if you try to control that, you're going to be doing a pilot-induced oscillation. So that is what we do in the flying world. So I translate that to real life and, control and performance. What can I control and what can I not control? And I try to focus on what I can control. So I can't control another person's behavior, and I love the parent example. I can set a good example for my children. I can teach them certain things that I think are important, and I'll repeat that over and over again, like my father did with me. He'd repeat with me, Eileen, he'd be like, be a leader, stop following the crowd. And, I try to do that with my kids, give them, things that they can control about their behavior. And then if somebody else does something, don't try to control it. You can try to influence them. And as a leader, you can put the rules out there. You can set a good example, knowledge, integrity, communication, all that stuff. But you've got, I think that's probably all I want to say about that. But think about when you come to a point where you have to make a decision or you have conflict, focus on what you can control.
Great lesson.
That's all I want to say about that. I could keep going on, but that's a great question.
The story has us, the timeline has us advance. Let's say after you wrapped up being a flight instructor in the T-38, your mind or the book captures that it's like, oh, wait, I need 1,000 hours of operational flight time. So there's another I got to go do something else to get this astronaut. And so off you went to the C-141 world. And the flights you mentioned there are these long flights out to Diego Garcia and other things like that. And at that point, I think it was during this period of time where you met your husband, Pat, right?
That's right.
So your first time I guess you're still married to your airplane always, but now you meet a new fella, right? And there's some great stories in there. I'm not sure where they play out, but there was, I think it was test pilot school. I'm probably getting ahead of the Air Force Academy, but there was a recruiting video where it showed, the perfect Air Force guy with his his spouse. So you did the Pat and Eileen video spoof.
So that video it was done in the early 60s. It's called Roy, R-O-Y, and Helen. So Roy was the perfect Air Force pilot. And his wife, Helen, was the perfect wife, and they had 2 kids. They pull up in front of the test pilot school in their station wagon. You remember those station wagons?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was a recruiting video for the test pilot school. Well, when I started test pilot school in 1990, our class decided to do a parody on it. And I was the class leader. I was a major when I started test pilot school. And we had a guy in our class, Jeff Smith. I got to credit him with the video. Jeff was a B-52 pilot at the time, and Jeff's like, let's make a Roy and Helen video, but let's do Pat and Eileen, and we'll have them switch roles. So we, pulled up in this big minivan in front of the school, and I'm in my flight suit, and Pat, my husband's an airline pilot, so he's wearing his airline pilot suit, and every one of the kids in our test pilot school class was in the van. And so we opened the door. Instead of the 2 kids coming out, there's like 20 kids coming out of the van, and the whole thing was kind of a joke. And we actually we did a documentary on the book, and we have a little bit of the Roy and Helen video in there. Now, if you search for Roy and Helen, the original video online, you're going to get all kinds of parodies on that. But it did kind of show it was a new world with more women going through pilot training.
I love the sense of humor you get from all these flight training experiences. Plus they dubbed you Mom, right?
Well, my call sign was Mom. Now, my first call sign was Crash. They called me Crash Collins, but it never stuck because I was always very straight arrow, follow the rules. I was not going to be out of control because we were being tested. We were the first women going through pilot training, and it was very important for me to follow the rules and prove to the Air Force that women can do it. So the Crash call sign never stuck. And then they started calling me IR, which these are instrument routes. And because of something that happened on an IR route, I was following the rules. I was at 1,000 feet on the IR route, and all of my classmates are down in the weeds. So they're like flying down at 200 feet. And I'm like, hey guys, I'm following the rules. I'm up here at 1,000 feet. So they started calling me IR. That never stuck. I ended up getting the call sign Mom because I would always be trying to take care of the guys in my class. I'd say, it's raining out, you need to have an umbrella, or, I try to, it looks like maybe you shouldn't fly today because you have a cold. And so I was like I was always trying to help my classmates. Right. And so okay, Mom. And so the Mom call sign stuck, and everywhere I went, they called me Mom because I was just trying to be helpful.
Yeah. And you were the class leader as a major at that time.
Yeah. So I was at the class leader at test pilot school. And then even in the astronaut program where I wasn't the class, they still called me Mom.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I don't want to say it's like herding cats, but as far as having to lead some very talented people in a flight class, and you document a lot of the ways that you would look out for them and try to take that role very seriously. So that was good.
Yeah, that's a very tough thing. There's a fine line there. When I was the class leader at test pilot school, I was the class leader because I was the senior ranking officer. I mean, no one picked me because of my performance. Like, you have more time in the Air Force than anyone else in this class, so you are the class leader. And I was, being a woman, I was only the second woman pilot to go through the Air Force test pilot school, and I have a class of 20. There were 25 of us in the class. You don't want to be too overbearing, and you don't want to be telling people what to do. And I think sometimes I might have hit my overreach point, and maybe I was being a little too directive when it came to things that needed to be done for the class. Like, what would happen is the school commandant would come to me, I need your class to do this, this, and this. And I would ask my class, how about if you do this? What really works is if you just ask for volunteers. So, and believe it or not, I would get volunteers. I would think no one would volunteer, but you don't want to be assigning these things. At least my leadership style, I learned you're better to ask for volunteers. And then if you don't get anything, you assign it. So I made a few mistakes there, but I think I also learned a lot, which carried with me into my astronaut future career.
And when you were in that role, and this is maybe like one of the last boxes you needed to check, right? And then I don't know, did you put in 2 applications during test pilot course, or? Because I know you were going to...
So the test pilot school, I applied 3 times to get in, and I got in on the 3rd try. but I needed a waiver. The limit at the time was 10 years and 2 months of time in service. And once you go over that, you're not allowed in test pilot school. I got a waiver to that because the previous 2 applications, I had administrative, like you need 3 years, you need 2 years time on station, or you needed 3 years, complete 3 years in your directed duty assignment. There were all these administrative reasons that they kicked my application out. So the third time I applied, I got a time and service waiver, which amazed me. And I get into my third try. Now the astronaut program, I get into my first try. So in a lot of that, all of these things have to do with timing. And I always encourage people, if you don't get in on your first shot, keep applying, no matter what school you're trying to apply to. And sometimes you should even apply before you're like totally eligible. Get an application in there. They might take it and like throw in a filing cabinet, using an old term there. Toss your application in the filing cabinet because you're not quite yet qualified. But yet then when you are qualified, they say, hey, look, this guy or gal, they've been applying. They really want to do this. So I think it's good to have the system, whether it's the personnel center here or maybe the leadership at the school you want to get into, that they know you and they know that you're really passionate about going there and doing that, doing that job, whatever it happens to be. So that was kind of the philosophy I used with, let me just tell you, it was painful. It was painful getting rejected. But
and there were a couple of times where you just withheld for a particular reason, like you didn't feel like you had served long enough in the particular assignment you were in.
Yeah, so that was a mistake I made. So I applied for the astronaut class of, I didn't apply, but I had the application fully ready to go for the astronaut class of 1984. Well, I was not eligible yet because I had not been through test pilot school yet. So really to be, I want to say competitive, you need to go through test pilot school. I filled out that entire application. The last thing was to get a letter from the wing commander, and I didn't do it. And, I was busy and I should have just gone to the wing commander and asked them, but I don't recommend that you drop it at that point. So that I would say that was a mistake I made. I probably wouldn't have gotten in it that young anyway, but now I tell people, go ahead and apply. And then I went to apply to the astronaut program a second time, and the Challenger accident happened. So I didn't apply after that. And I applied for the next class, which was the class of 1990.
And
so that's how it worked, but nothing is ever easy.
And you were astronaut class 13, right?
That's right.
And you named
were group
yourselves
13.
The Hairballs?
Well, the way that developed was we had a few Air Force people and Navy people in our class, in Army. We had the military representation there, and so we had to do a class patch. And our class is like, oh, we're group 13, so let's put a black cat on our patch. So we did. We put the black cat on there, and because NASA makes these patches with government money, it had to be approved at NASA headquarters in Washington. Well, one of the original shuttle astronauts named Kathy Sullivan saw our patch, and Kathy said, it's not going to get approved because when we had the Space Shuttle Mission 13, we put a black cat on the patch and headquarters rejected it, and they made us do something else. So what our class did, we had 2 patches. We had the one with the black cat, and then in which we could named it the Hairballs. So we were group 13, the Hairballs. And then we had a serious patch that had the Earth, the Moon, and Mars on it.
Yeah, officially sanctioned. So, NASA approved.
NASA, because of Apollo 13, NASA is still a little bit superstitious about the number 13.
Yeah. Well, explain or tell me a little bit about you used the term slam dunk, that that was for the role of pilot, right? NASA was looking for the first, because I know you could join NASA, become an astronaut through a mission specialist, but you actually joined and got in as a pilot.
Well, the way it worked is, I was in test pilot school when So I applied before I went to test pilot school, but the way the flow went was I was actually in the school when the astronaut board met.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are in the military, and I think this is still true today, you have to go through a pre-selection board in your specific service before they will forward your name to the NASA board. So I had to meet the Air Force board. When the Air Force board looked at my record, they said, oh, she hasn't completed test pilot school yet. So they sent me to NASA as a mission specialist. So when I eventually went to NASA to interview, I interviewed as a mission specialist. So when I was doing the one-on-one, well, it's actually not one-on-one, it's like 14 on one. So there's like 14 astronauts and you walk in there and they start bombing these questions at you. 3 times they asked me, would you rather be a pilot? Now, I just wanted to be an astronaut. I mean, ideally, the best place for me was as a pilot because that's what I am. The mission specialists were more engineers, scientists, doctors. Although we did have some military pilots that went mission specialists, but they were not test pilots. So I was actually more qualified for the pilot job, but I hadn't graduated from test pilot school yet. So my interview went on like this. Wouldn't you rather be a pilot? Oh, come on, tell us you'd rather be a pilot. And I kept answering the same way. I'll do either pilot or a mission specialist. And I really felt that at the time. But I was surprised by the questions. And as I left the interview, I went, well, maybe I am more qualified as a pilot. Maybe I should have told them that. But they selected me as a pilot, even though the Air Force sent me to the interview as a mission specialist. Mm-hmm. They selected me as a pilot. And the way I got the phone call. It was in January of 1990, and it was the NASA. I'm not going to go through the whole story now. It's in the book, but I ended up on the phone with John Young, who was the first astronaut to land the space shuttle. He also walked on the moon, and he's like a big hero of mine. And I'm on the phone with John Young, and he's like, "Do you still want to come down to Johnson Space Center to be an astronaut?" I'm like, "Yes, sir. Yes." And by the way, I'm in the administration office at the test pilot school, and the sergeant, the gal who's the admin person at the test pilot school, is sitting there listening to this whole thing. And he says, so John Young says to me, "Would you, well, you still want to come to Johnson Space Center?" I'm like, "Well, yes, sir." And then he goes into this long, like 3-minute long, "Well, we're happy to have you come, and we have simulators, we have T-38s, and he's going on and on with all these jobs. You can be in this job or that job, or we have these missions coming up." And then at the end, he's like, "Do you have any questions?" I go, "Yeah, are you bringing me in as a mission specialist or a pilot?" Well, "Oh, yeah, pilot. You're going to be our first woman pilot." And I felt like this big weight had come off my shoulders because it's something I wanted to do my whole life. And I was like, "Well, thank you, sir." And I hung the phone up and I'm just standing there. And the admin gal's like, "Congratulations." Oh, and by the way, NASA told me don't tell anybody until tomorrow. So I went back I had just come out of a 837 flight, and now I'm going back into the classroom, and I couldn't tell anybody. And I'm just sitting there like, what's my life going to be like? But I did tell my husband. He was very happy.
Yeah. That's I like the way the people who were, your reputation was out ahead of you at that point, and they used the term slam dunk, and I thought that was like, your performance as a test pilot, your performance as an instructor pilot, like this person, to quote that classic NASA phrase, is a steely-eyed missile woman, right? Like you were just that going back to that quote of like, know how you show up to life, like be prepared, be focused on how you show up. It was just, I think that term slam dunk kind of very.
Well, there's one thing I can add to that. When I talk to young people that are going to pilot training and they ask for my advice, I think one of the, I'm very procedural, which I think you need to be in the military. The best advice I would give to someone going into pilot training is to chair fly. Yes. And that's where you sit in your chair and you are going through procedures, everything from walking out to the plane, doing the walk around, taxiing out, making radio calls. And when you fly in the military, everything is going so fast. you have got to be ahead of the airplane. You can't leave your brain back there in the, I say back in the chocks, back in the ramp. You have to be thinking like, what am I doing now? What am I doing next? That is a very difficult thing to do. And I got through pilot training by chair flying over and over and over again. Just go all by myself in a room. You're sitting in the chair. You have the checklist there, and you close your eyes and you imagine yourself flying maneuvers, making radio calls, and you try to do it with your eyes closed, and you try to memorize as much as you can. And I think, the question you were asking me there makes me think, yeah, I'm very procedural, because I don't think you can feel your way through life successfully. I mean, feelings are an important part of our life, but you have to have structure. And for me, structure, procedures, having a foundation that is concrete, you've got to have a good grasp of that. And then the feelings can come later, I think, but you've got to have a foundation to work on. And the other thing is, we're all human. We all have feelings, and we all have a certain degree of fear, happiness, sadness. Then you get shock and panic, and things can happen in the airplane. You're like, oh my God, I never thought about this. And maybe a malfunction might happen in a way that you've never been trained. But if you have that foundation of like the basic, we train like one malfunction at a time, but I find in the real world, you can have like two of them. And also the way electrical systems fail, they never fail the way they fail in the simulator. Electrical systems are always weird when they fail. They do stuff that you've never seen before. But if you have that foundation of how the system works normally and how it works with single failures in different places, then I think you're much better prepared to handle the real world failures. And I hope that helps, but that's kind of the way I think when you talked about, you got to show up. You got to show up prepared.
Yeah. As your journey unfolds in the book about learning to become an astronaut, I kind of summarized that chapter as gut punches, mission delays, and family delays. So you ended up becoming almost the last person to fly a mission in your class.
That's right.
And you got that, you were promised something, and that particular leader forgot to fix the promise, right, when it didn't deliver.
Yep. So I put a lot of stories in the book like that, maybe in the old days people wouldn't want to write those stories, but I think they have to be written because I learned so much from that. One of the examples was I was told that I was going to be on a certain space shuttle flight, and then the mission was announced and I wasn't on it. And I thought, what happened? Why did they forget about me? And so I think I try to put myself in the other person's position. My father always told me this: put yourself in the other person's position. That person had so much going on that he forgot to tell me that I was taken off the flight. I've forgiven him. It was, now I look back, it was not that big of a deal. I was then assigned to another flight. That was announced, and right after it was announced, we delayed 9 months. We delayed over top of 5 other space shuttle flights. And there's nothing I could do about that. It hurt, I think, and I see today's astronauts going through the same thing, and I really feel for them. You're going to eventually fly. It was hard for me to wait. It was hard for me. I had to go out of training and go back into a job and then come back into training later. When we were first day, this is an important story, so I'm going to back up a little bit. My first day as an astronaut, our class was, in our first meeting, the chief of the office, Dan Brandenstein, who's a Navy captain, came in and gave us a talk, and he said, this program is not fair. I cannot make it fair. There's no way. One of you's going to fly first and one of you's going to fly last. I cannot make it fair. He said, what I expect out of you is when the first person flies, I want the other 22 of you to support that person. And then when the last one flies, I want the other 22 of you to support the last one. Because this is a team effort here. And I thank Dan to this day. I'll never forget him saying that, because our class responded to that and we supported each other. We had an absolutely wonderful astronaut class, and maybe 1 or 2 of us would fly on a mission, and it took 5 years for the whole class to get flown. But we did support each other, and it's always hard to wait. you just have to, you have to go into the what do I have control over and what do I not have control over. And if you try to control your flight assignment, it depends on how you do it. If there's a way in the system for you to do that, that's great. But to go around the system and kind of cut other people off, that's not cool. And people will find out eventually if you're the kind of person that tries to like go around the system or go schmooze with the boss and, kind of throw like, I want to say throw your weight around where it doesn't belong. I mean, I've done that at various points in my life and I kind of feel guilty about it. So I think that we sort of need to, the whole thing I'm talking about here is having the team effort. And I think in the long run, the bosses know who the team players are. So fortunately, the astronauts are great.
Yeah.
They really are. I mean, we hire people that are team players.
And so you had the blessing, the privilege to fly 4 missions, 2 as a pilot, 2 as a mission commander. Which of the 4 flights do you feel was the most stressful or?
Oh, without a doubt, the last one was the most stressful in different ways. Like the first one was stressful, I think physically, because it was my first time in space. And once I got up there, my body had to equalize with the environment. You get a fluid shift when you go up in space. Your face gets fat, kind of bloated, the wrinkles go away. That's always nice. Your legs get skinny. But with that fluid shift, you have your body, like for the next 2 or 3 days, is trying to figure out what's going on here. I mean, we never evolved that way. Not only have my body's never been in that weird microgravity. One thing that happens is your brain thinks it's overhydrated. So you're in the bathroom the first day or two, like you're in the bathroom losing a lot of fluids. So you've got to drink, or you could get kidney stones. And that's very important to always be pushing fluids while you're up there, frankly, the entire mission. But yeah, so that was difficult. And I also got the stomach awareness and the disorientation. And I had these tasks to do, like I had to put the, the bicycle ergometer together, and pieces kept flying around. So that was hard physically. Without a doubt, professionally, the most difficult was my last one, because we had just had the Columbia accident in 2003, and my crew was 5 weeks from launch when that accident happened. And of course, we didn't fly in 5 weeks because we had an accident investigation. The accident I'm talking about was Columbia. They were coming home from the mission, and the shuttle broke up over Texas, and there was no way the crew could have survived that. The wing broke off was what actually happened. So we had to go through that was the worst time in my life. You trying to support the families, you're trying to support the accident investigation. I was asked to stay on and fly what we call the return to flight mission. And we had to fix all these problems. And so for the next 2.5 years, myself and my crew, which some of them got changed, but my crew worked with the shuttle program to fix the problems that caused the accident, as well as fix other problems that could cause an accident. And I have actually a couple chapters on that in the book, and a lot of lessons in there on culture, because the accident board, of course, they blamed the physical cause of the accident, which was there was a crack in the wing. The heat shield had a crack in it. And when the shuttle heated up, the wing broke off. But just as much to blame as the crack in the wing was the culture at NASA. And the accident board hit the NASA culture, specifically the space shuttle program, very hard in that report. And you can find, if you're interested, you can find the report online. It's called the CAIB, C-A-I-B, Columbia Accident Investigation Board report. It's on the NASA website, but you can just go to your browser and type in Columbia Accident Report, and it'll pop up. And honestly, this is a horrible thing to say, but it was the best accident report I've ever read. Of course, accidents are horrible, but the way that report was written, you can skip over the technical parts and just read the parts about the culture, and you will see yourself in that report. Wow. I mean, there were emails going around. I mean, one engineer wrote, is somebody going to do something about this? This is the night before the shuttle broke up. An engineer wrote, is somebody going to do something about this, or are we just going to sit on our hands and hope for the best? So people knew there was something wrong, but they were afraid to speak up. I'm not blaming that engineer. I'm blaming the fact that he was afraid to speak up because no one was going to listen to him. And so there's a lot of that was going on in the space shuttle program. Some people may be being intimidated, or, oh, we tried that before, it's not going to work this time. Or, hey, I'm the expert, you can't argue with me, I know everything.
Mhm.
Or, oh, believe the model's right, it must be right because, well, the model was wrong because the model was totally done by analysis. There was no data that went into this model. This is important because in the future, we're using artificial intelligence, even in the military, to make decisions. That scares me.
Mhm.
And I say, I am more willing to rely on AI if there's a lot of reliable data going into that particular AI algorithm. If there's not a lot of reliable data, you cannot believe what it's telling you to do. And that kind of stuff was coming out, even before we had artificial intelligence. Like, oh, we got to believe the model because the model says this. Well, the
Mhm.
model was wrong. It
Right.
was a good model. It just didn't have enough data in it to make it reliable.
Yeah.
So I could go on and on about this, but um, I could have probably written an entire separate book on the Columbia accident. But there's a couple of books out there on Columbia, but not many. And if people are interested in learning about how a culture can cause people to make bad decisions that might eventually result in a fatal accident, that the Columbia accident report is
Mhm.
probably the classic example of what you'd want to read to learn more about that.
Apollo 13 was my only, like probably a lot of people, my only understanding of a lot of things that go on. But that movie was, I used it in a lot of my leadership training with my young pilots. And, Gene Kranz, Mission Control, he's like, and then finally that one engineer who was the electrical guy said, power's everything, power's everything. And so that's a micro slice of that culture. You have the second in charge saying, no, we're not going to do that. No, we're not going to do that. So, yeah, that'd be a great place for
There's a
people
couple of books out there on Apollo 13 that are good to read. And they say it was NASA's finest moment. We brought those 3 astronauts back alive. And by the way, Jim Lovell is just turned 97. So the commander of who Tom Hanks played him in the movie. And by the way, that's probably the best space movie out there, Apollo 13. They tried their best to make it as accurate as possible. Tom Hanks played the commander, Jim Lovell. And, he made the famous call, Houston, we have a problem, which is, you hear that phrase everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
And I think I compare Apollo 13, which I do think was NASA's finest moment. Columbia that we lost 7 crew members. We could have rescued them. And we missed a huge opportunity. If we had known that there was a crack in the wing, and I don't have time to go into the whole story, but when the shuttle launched, engineers that were watching the launch saw this big piece of foam. It was like 2 feet long, weighed about 2 pounds, come down, hit the shuttle wing. They didn't see it directly hit, but they saw all this debris come out below the wing. They're like, we think there might be some damage to that wing, which is the heat shield. Maybe we ought to get the Air Force. They didn't have Space Force back then. Maybe we ought to get the Air Force to get their satellites to turn them on Columbia. Well, they did. They got the paperwork going, and the Air Force is like, yeah, we'll do it. So Columbia is up there in space. The astronauts didn't know anything had happened to them. When the Air Force was getting ready to turn the satellites to get a close-up picture of Columbia, someone at NASA had people higher up in NASA canceled the request. Don't take the pictures. They were never taken. And had those pictures been taken, and we saw there was a crack in the wing, we could have launched a rescue mission and brought those astronauts back.
Gosh, yeah.
You couldn't save Columbia. You'd have to ditch it in the ocean, but you could have launched Atlantis and done a rendezvous and bring the spacesuits over, and the astronauts would have to do a spacewalk over too. There was a way to do that and bring the astronauts back alive. It would have been, without a doubt, NASA's finest moment. It would have probably blown away Apollo 13, and the whole world would have been watching this. But it never happened because the pictures were never taken. And there's a whole lot of reasons why the pictures weren't taken. It's all in the report. It was February of 2023, and we were getting ready to go to war in Afghanistan. You might remember, in the Middle East. No, it was Iraq, because we had already been in Afghanistan. We were getting ready to invade Iraq, which happened in March of 2003. And they were like, oh, don't bother the Air Force. They got better things to do, And anyway, the pictures were never taken. It's like, oh, if we knew there was damage, there's nothing we could do, or nobody knew how to solve that problem. So let's just pretend we don't have a problem. And, my take on that is you have to know if you have a problem, and your people, if you ask them to solve a problem that you've never faced before, it is amazing how creative they will become, and they will figure out something to do. But it was figured out after the fact. Oh yeah, just roll Atlantis out, put the crew that just flew it, they're fully trained, launch them up there and do this rendezvous. And anyway, it never happened. And we lost the astronauts. And there's so much to be learned from that. The United States is getting ready to go back to the moon. Next year, we're supposed to fly a mission with 4 astronauts. They're going to circle the moon, and the next mission after that, they will land on the moon. There's a lot of technical issues with that program right now, and NASA needs to continue to learn from Apollo 1, which was the fire in the launch pad, Challenger 1986, where the shuttle blew up on the way up, and then the Columbia accident of 2003, where the wing broke off on the way home. Those were 3 major human, where we lost fatal accidents, where we lost astronauts during the entire space program. There's been 3. Someone did a study one time, and they compared military fatalities versus injuries to astronaut fatalities versus injuries. And the interesting that came out of that, there's no injuries in the astronaut corps. It's either you die or you come back alive, but you don't come back injured, which I find very interesting. I don't know what you would do with that piece of information, but it's just kind of interesting.
They didn't grab your data when you left your crew notebook and you bumped your leg or cut yourself.
Yeah, I cut my leg. It was bleeding a little. Yeah, at least that wasn't really a
Class A.
I wouldn't call that an injury. It was kind of funny. No, I left my crew notebook on the Mir space station, and we were closing the hatch, and I'm like, oh, I think I left my crew notebook over there, and I was the pilot at the time. So my commander, Charlie Precourt, he's a Air Force F-15 guy, Charlie's like, okay, Eileen, we'll wait for you, but you better make it fast. So I go floating like as fast as I possibly can all the way down through the Mir space station. They don't do sharp edge inspections in Russia, or at least they didn't do them at the time. And I slid right over something sharp, and I put a big gash down my leg. And I had pants on too. It cut right through the pants. And I'm like, that hurt. But you don't ever want to do anything too fast. Anyway, I recovered my crew notebook. I never would have got that back. That had everything in it. And I needed that even to fly home. But if it had ended up in Russia, it probably would have gotten sold on the black market or something. I never would have seen it again. Yeah. But it was worth that. I wouldn't call that an injury, but it makes for a good story.
Mm-hmm. Now, we were talking a little bit about the return to flight, but your first mission command you were invited to the White House for that first mission command?
Yes, that was 1998. Bill Clinton was president, and I was told by NASA, the White House, which at the time the first lady was Mrs. Clinton, and she wanted to announce the first woman shuttle commander. So, we did our little, we obey what they tell us to do because we're good soldiers. So I'm like, I don't really want to do this, but NASA's like, well, it's a must do. You have to go. So I had to put a speech together. So we worked on that. I got someone at NASA to help me with the speech. And I thank our public affairs, Eileen Hawley, helped me with, who's got to have a theme. And the theme we made was dreams do come true. So I go up there with my husband, and it was in the Roosevelt room in the White House. And the first thing we did, so I met Sally Ride in the hallway. I've never met Sally Ride before. She was the first American woman in space. I've never seen her since, because she was teaching at the time. And so I met her in the hallway. I go, that was pretty cool. And then we went and met the president and the first lady, and there was a lot of advisors there, and the NASA administrator and whatnot. They're like, okay, now we're going to go across the hall over there and do the little thing for the country, do the press conference, I guess they called it. And I looked out of the Oval Office across the hallway and into this Roosevelt room, and there was a huge bank of cameras, lights, people. The room was packed. And I looked in there, and for only the second time in my life, I actually panicked. And to me, panic is a physical thing. Like it started, the sweat started here, and it went down to my feet. And I said to my husband, I go, I'm not going in there. I actually said that. I go, I'm not going in there. I'm done. I don't want to do this. I am not a camera person, is what I was. I'm a pilot. I just want to fly. And so my husband didn't say anything. If he did, I don't remember. But he probably encouraged me. But I was like, and then I went, wait a minute. You're not Eileen anymore. You're the first woman shuttle commander. Just be the first woman shuttle commander, and it will be over, and then you can be Eileen again. And I said that to myself, and I was okay. And I went in there, so the president spoke, the first lady spoke, and then the NASA administrator spoke, if I remember correctly. And then I got up and I said my thing, and then we left, and it was over. And I went, okay. I went back home and got back in the simulator, in the airplane, and I was fine. I don't want to do that again. But, now I think about it, I'm okay with it now that I've had that experience. This is the way you handle it. It's not about me. That's how you do it. It's not about me. It's about the mission. So I think I have trained myself to have that attitude. Get out of yourself. I was very afraid to get up in front of a group of people and speak back my whole life. I was a junior in college, and ROTC had me stand up in front of my class and give a talk on national security something. And I was so scared. And I learned I had to get over being afraid of getting up in front of a group of people. So I joined Toastmasters in the Air Force. And I started doing these practice speeches in front of a small group of people. I eventually got over the fear, most of my fear, by teaching. I think being a classroom teacher is very helpful to get over fear of public speaking, because if you're a military officer, you have got to get up in front of people and speak. That is part of your responsibility. As a leader, you have to be able to do that. And if you have a fear of being in front of people, you just got to get over that. And I think I'm a professional speaker now, so I think I've finally gotten over it. I mean, when I was in second grade, I stuttered, and my mother sent me to speech classes to get over the stuttering, which I eventually did. And so I think I just naturally am a shy person, although I'm kind of told that by the psychological testing, I'm told that I'm an extrovert, which means I gain energy from being with people. But yet that doesn't mean that you're a natural speaker. So there's a lot to say in that one. I mean, you asked me about the White House and the visit there, but there's a lot of lessons that come out of that. And that's why I wrote about it in the book, because I want young people to read about the things that I did in my career that maybe, like I say, I've only panicked twice. The other time I was 13 years old. So that's a whole nother story. I've never really panicked in the airplane, which is a testament to the training. Because panic happens if you're not really prepared for something, or something happens that you'd never thought about before. And so I hope by reading either my book or other books that young people can learn from other people's experiences.
And you touched a little bit about that last mission, the return to flight. Why was that? I mean, there's a lot of pressure to come back after a big setback. So tell us a little bit about that, and then this will be our last little mission chat, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, so the last mission, there's a lot I could say about that. The whole world was watching us. I was extremely well prepared to be the commander of that mission. In fact, when the accident happened, I remember saying to people in my office, I'm going to fly this mission if it takes 5 years, because we're ready to go. I feel extremely well prepared. We're going to fix the problems that caused the accident. Well, during the return to flight period, which was 2.5 years, I didn't have a job description. I had to kind of figure out what to do. NASA headquarters told me to keep training, but they didn't know what they were talking about. I couldn't train because my crew went off to support the accident. investigation, and to support the families of the crew that we lost. So I had pretty much lost my crew. So I made it a point to go out and talk to the shuttle managers, the flight directors, the flight controllers. I took my crew when I could. We went to visit all these different factories that build different parts of the shuttle, the external tank, the boosters, the engines, the orbiter itself. We went up to the accident site, which was in West Texas. We talked to the people up there. We helped do a search. There was like a 2-month-long search that was going on for pieces of the shuttle that had fallen down from 200,000 feet. They were all over the place. And so, and people were hurting. So I felt like if I had gone and just listened to people and they would tell me their story about like, oh, I was here when the accident happened and this is how I felt. This is what I'm doing now. And I thought that was really helpful. So I did that for a long time until we finally got our crew together and started training again. And I really wanted to be the commander of the return to flight mission only because I felt so well prepared. And I knew over the previous 13 years, I had just gotten to know so many people throughout the shuttle program. I didn't understand that there was a culture problem. And so maybe the last thing I want to say about that, if you are in a position of leadership, in my case, an astronaut commander, you don't always know where the problems are because people are kind of afraid to speak up. Mm-hmm. And we would, go to factories and they'd be, oh, let me show you what I do. And, oh, everything's great here. Well, no, it isn't. It's never great. And so I learned after the accident to actually ask people, how are things going here? And they may not want to answer that because it's too general. So I'd say, what is your number one complaint? Or what's your frustration? Or and I would sometimes get an earful from people. And there wasn't always something I could do about it. Mm-hmm. But at least people would say, oh, now the astronauts know about that. And so I really think as leaders, you cannot take those kind of things for granted. You have got to listen to what your people say. And you also have to tell them, I can't fix every problem here. And I can't give you all the money you want because they all want money for their project. And, there's just not enough money to fund all of these. So if someone's project for our mission, because everyone had like something they wanted to do, I would tell them, thank you for the work that you did. But, I'm sorry it didn't get funded, but now we need you to join this group over here that did get funded. If they were in a position to do that and so I took on that role, which was kind of a mothering role, I think, and my mom call sign sort of continued, but I went into that return to flight period with a lot of pain from the loss of 7 people. And you always wondered, could I have done something to prevent that from happening? And a lot of people had pain afterwards, like, what could I have done? I knew something and I didn't speak up because I was intimidated. And maybe I shouldn't let myself be intimidated by a boss that's going to shut me down. Mm. I mean, even the accident board blamed the silent safety culture. I mean, in the accident report, it says there were people who were assigned to the safety job that were sitting along the wall during a meeting where this topic came up. Oh, we think the shuttle might have damage. They didn't speak up because they were intimidated. Because they were, in the past, it was like, we don't want to listen to you. And I've seen people running meetings saying, what are you doing wearing that pin? Take that pin off, or, don't come into my meeting wearing that. You should wear that instead. I mean, you immediately intimidate people when the boss does things like that. Mm. So, and I would try to take that story around. So I think that, and then the actual mission itself, I have a whole chapter on it in the book. You can read it, but the mission itself went very well. It went like clockwork. And there were several things that happened that weren't planned. And we, working with mission control, we were able to handle those things. But it turned out to be, I came back and my boss thanked me. And I was like, I really appreciate that, that you said thanks. He said your crew did fantastic up there. And I passed that on to my crew. I said, hey, the boss gives you his kudos. Y'all did great. And which means something coming from the next level up. Mm-hmm. So, that's kind of what all I'll say about that mission. A lot of that is really pre-mission stuff, but the hardest part of flying that return to flight mission was the preparation for it, without a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just executed it. And I'm really proud of my crew. They're all off doing something different now. We still keep in touch, and and that's good. Everybody's out working some different job now, taking the lessons that they learned out to different parts of the country and the world.
So that mission was 20 years ago, 21?
This summer, it'll be 20 years.
20 years.
This July,
yeah.
it'll be
So
20 years.
That's been your swan song, right? So for the last 20 years, you've been kind of on the trail, telling your stories, lecturing, enjoying family, raising children.
Yeah. So when I retired from NASA and retired from the Air Force, I decided, several of my mentor people said, don't do anything for 6 months. One person said, don't do anything for a year. So I was kind of, plus both my parents died, and I was actually the executor of my father's estate. They died 3 months and 6 months after I came back from my mission. And so that kept me very busy. And that was hard because I had my family, and there was a lot of other, our house got hit by a hurricane. My husband's company went into bankruptcy. I mean, all this happened like right after I came back from the mission. And I went into okay, Eileen, one day at a time, because that could break you. And all those things happening. And plus I had my 2 kids, they were 4 and 9 years old, and I had to take care of them. And so I'm like, I just go into one day at a time. It's going to work out. It's going to be okay. You're going to get through this. They say when you're going through hell, keep on going. I mean, that was coming back to that mission was, another, I think about all the stuff going on at the same time, like seemed like the perfect storm. Everything happened at once. So I just do one day at a time. And then at the 1 year point after the mission, things had finally kind of started settling down in my life. And I started doing board work. For example, I went on the NASA Advisory Council, which was a great thing for me to do because the shuttle was still flying, and I was in a position to advise NASA based on my experience. And I did a couple other things, national academies. I went on the Athletic Corporation at the Air Force Academy. I helped them get that started because I had taught there previously, and I knew people up there. My husband is an Academy graduate, so all of that helped. And so I did that for a while, and it wasn't until 2020 that I wrote the book. So now I've kind of come off the board work. I was on the USAA board also, the insurance company, which, by the way, is a great company. USA, just wonderful company. They will take care of you if you have some kind of a claim. But now I'm just, the book has been made into a documentary. It's not out yet. It's going to come out sometime later in 2025. But a filmmaker, Keith Haviland, he pretty much does space and aviation. He liked my book, so he immediately asked if he could have the rights to do a documentary. We waited a while. I waited a while because I wasn't ready for that yet. And I eventually signed up because I thought, let's work on the story mainly I want the film to be something that a young person can watch and that parents will approve. Yes, there's nothing bad in there. It's all stuff that parents would let their kids watch. So they could watch that and say, well, maybe I want to be an Air Force pilot someday. Maybe I want to be an astronaut someday. What's that like? And it doesn't show Eileen doing perfect things all the way. It shows Eileen has a problem, setback, fix it, move on. Problem, setback, fix it, move on. So it shows. So I was hoping that that's what would come out. The film runs about 90 minutes or so. Right now, we're trying to find a platform to put it out on. It's in the film. It's in the film festival routine right now.
Yeah.
So.
And what about grandma? Is there a potential to be a grandma out there?
Yeah. So my kids are now in their 20s, and my son is married. He's 24, and my daughter's 29. So she keeps telling me, "Mom, I'm never getting married." So I just kind of laugh at her. We'll see how that goes. She's really into her career now, but she'll get married someday. I'm sure she will. But it's fun to watch them. Neither one of them wanted to be pilot or astronaut or join the military. But I always told my kids, "You're not me. You're a different person. I'm here to help you, raise you and help you out in life. But you need to pick your own career." So my son does this goofy AI, artificial intelligence. He's very smart. He's an AI checker, so he checks the algorithm to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do, or he makes sure the right data gets fed into it. And my daughter is in the energy industry. She did oil and gas for a while. Then she did wind and solar, and she's been in like 5 different jobs. So she keeps moving around,
Mhm.
and she's soaking up she loves being out there and working. She likes to travel and work with teams. So those are my kids. They'll be who they are.
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
I still worry about them. It doesn't matter how old they
Yep.
get.
Hey, that's the mom in you, right?
But that's what I have.
Yeah. Great. Well, I thank you so much for coming out to the Dedalian headquarters, sharing your story with us.
Oh, by the way, I should say one other thing. I am a professional speaker, and I have a whole speech that I give on the Columbia accident and lessons learned. So if anyone, listening would like to hear that speech, or I also have a General Gee Whiz astronaut speech, probably that's my primary thing right now. But thank you very much.
Well, again,
That's
it's been a pleasure. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. This was a great discussion, kind of a nice way to relive the past and share my stories.
Yeah, and this place is so full of aviation history,
Oh, yeah. So, for your listeners, if they've never been out here, this place is great. We just did a little tour, and I'm looking at the photos on the wall and the history, and I know there's books here, and it's right on Randolph Air Force Base. So if you ever come here, come on by the Dedalians headquarters. This place is wonderful.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I think that's a wrap. Oh, wake up, puppy dog.